Good morning, everyone. We're still letting some people in, but we will make a start. So welcome to today's webinar on contract management and compliance. I'm Victoria, the Education Business Manager at Education Buying, and joining me today is Nathan. Good morning, Nathan.
Good morning, Victoria. It's been a chilly week, hasn't it? But do you know what? Just as we've started to think about contract management, the sun has come out, which shows that the good Lord shines upon those who value good procurement.
It does. As always, please do pop any questions into the chat and we will answer them as we go along or at the end. And I'm sure that you all have at some point felt overwhelmed by contracts, confused about your obligations, or just wondered how to stay compliant under the new Procurement Act. If so, this session is definitely for you. Now, before we start, we're going to run a quick poll to see where the biggest pain points are with contract management. So what's your school's biggest contract management challenge? Is it tracking key dates, keeping contracts organised, monitoring supplier performance, ensuring compliance with procurement regulations, finding the time to manage it all properly, or not sure where to start?
Or just overwhelmed by the fun of it all. We should have that one on there as well.
I'm sure there's some stories around some of those as well, which would be interesting to hear later. I can always remember going into one school and the school business manager said, "Oh, just go and get the contract." And I think it was about 20 minutes later she reappeared.
The bottom of the filing cabinet.
It certainly was.
Yeah.
Not sure if I'd. Thank you for submitting your answers to that. Got to submit mine to see the results. There we go. The top result there was finding the time to manage it all properly, and we can definitely relate to that. And then on par with that, it was compliance, monitoring, and tracking key dates. So yeah, absolutely. We'll cover these and hopefully give you some solutions on these today. So to start with, there's our agenda, what we will be covering. And to start with, Nathan, we're going to start with the big picture. So contract management, as we've said, can feel overwhelming. So Nathan, could you walk us through the typical life cycle of a contract in a school or trust?
I certainly can, yes. So if we just move on to the next slide. So it's important to see contract management as not just a thing on its own. It is part of the wider, what we call the procurement cycle. A typical procurement cycle, as we have maybe gone through over the last few webinars, includes sort of three distinct phases, if you will. There's the pre-procurement phase, which involves the all-important defining the requirements or understanding the need. Once you've done that, you may draft a specification or criteria which articulates clearly what it is that you are looking to purchase, be it goods or services. You would then prepare some form of tender document or quotation document. You may look into the market to see who are the typical or who are available in terms of potential bidders. And then we come to the procurement phase, where we issue the tender out, be that through some sort of electronic system or email. You would then evaluate and receive and evaluate those submissions, award, notify of the award to those bidders and provide a debrief to unsuccessful bidders. And then at some point you award the contract and sign the contract. That in itself can sometimes take a little while. And then we come on to this little tiny orange box, bit here, which is the contract management phase. Now, it looks a really small part of the procurement cycle, but actually, if you was to lay this out in terms of timeline, that little small orange box there that says contract management KPIs actually takes up the majority of the procurement cycle in terms of timescale and probably effort. So if we think about contracts that, and I'm thinking about mostly those services type contracts or those long-term contracts that can sometimes be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I mean, I've awarded contracts. The longest one I ever awarded was a 25-year contract, which is just crazy to think about how things could change over 25 years. But that phase there, the contract management phase, is a really important part. However, the reason I emphasize the whole procurement cycle is because the most influence you can have, for good or for bad, on your contract actually happens at the pre-procurement phase. So it's really important to understand the risks. It's important to understand the needs. It's important to sort of think about the potential issues that could arise during that contract at the pre-procurement phase. Unfortunately, public procurement is quite unforgiving when it comes to making changes in contracts. And in some cases, it's very difficult to exit a contract without having to then fully retender it. So it's really important, Victoria, that we spend a lot of time at the pre-procurement phase and give ourselves enough time to properly think about the contract. And that could be things like including a KPI schedule, so key performance indicators. What do we want to measure the performance of the supplier on? You know, what terms is the contract going to be concluded on? And again, there's always advantage to ensuring that it's on buyer's terms. So we have to think about the risks up front. So at pre-procurement stage, it's about identifying the potential risk, and sometimes that is about pulling together a bit of a procurement risk matrix. You may need to seek advice from technical experts or subject matter experts. You know, what are the potential pitfalls? What are the potential issues that could arise during the contract? If you're not sure, then you may find that undertaking some what we call preliminary market consultation is really valuable, because we're not always the best people to know what we should include in a contract or in a specification. So again, all this has a bearing on how the contract will perform going forward. It might be that you want to do some benchmarking with other colleagues and networks and other MATs and schools. Really importantly, at pre-procurement phase, it's about getting the right legal input to ensure that the risks that you've identified in the contract are mitigated. So again, it's about putting together a good, comprehensive specification, which is effectively is your shopping list. This is what we want you to deliver, when, where, how much, etc. But then the legal input on the terms and conditions is about having good clauses in there around, well, who's responsible if it fails? What happens if it fails? How do we resolve disputes? What happens if we want to terminate? You know, all these big questions. Don't leave it to the supplier or the bidder to come up with the solution, because obviously, naturally, they'll always favour their own position on that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that position just might not provide you with sufficient remedies to be able to manage these risks. And ultimately, it's about understanding the market. What are the typical types of pitfalls, risks, and terms that we would want to ensure are in the contract based on the type of market that we are going out for? We know over the last sort of 5 years, particularly, that supply chains contracts, you know, have been subject to quite a lot of issues, you know, around things like COVID-19, globalized issues, the conflicts across the world. Supply chains are incredibly complex. So as well, it's also about focusing on not just on the principal or primary supplier, but being aware of the wider supply chain. In some cases, the second, third, fourth, fifth tier supplier. So again, building into your contract, how is the primary supplier managing their supply chain and what are the risks to you? So contract management shouldn't be difficult as long as you've thought about it up front, as long as you've built into your contract, as long as at the pre-procurement stage you've really considered, and it's that planning stage that's really, really important around preparing the specifications. Don't rush a procurement. As I always say, procurement time is the best friend or the worst enemy of procurement when it comes to these things. So again, it's about ensuring that all of that is articulated in a fair and compliant manner, that all bidders are working off the same terms. When you implement that contract, that you have a good onboarding process, that you've even thought about things like exit at the end of the contract. And it's very hard to think, what does that look like in 5 years' time? But what do you need to build into the contract now in order to ensure that a supplier works with you and potentially works with a different supplier when you go back out to procurement again, because obviously the public procurement regulations require you to do that. So, and there's no assumption that you can just keep one supplier for adding for an item for an evergreen contract. The assumption is you will have to reprocure. So it's thinking about how do we manage that exit going forward. And yes, monitoring and performance. So what KPIs do you want to build in site visits if it's a supplier? And I know that Education Buying, we do that. We recently visited the warehouse and supply arrangements of one of our stationery providers, and it was great because you get to build relationships. Ultimately, contracts are relationships. In my 25 years of doing procurement, there's been very few occasions where I've come across very toxic people in terms of they're out to get you, they're out to do one over on you. Majority of people, majority of suppliers just want to have a good business. They just want to perform. They just want to do a good job. Yes, there are always exceptions, but ultimately it comes down to what's in the contract. Because if it does ever get to a dispute, if it does ever get to a legal process, then it's all about the contract. And you can inadvertently enter into oral contracts if you're not careful. So do make sure that you plan in advance. You think about these things pre-procurement, that you build all of these considerations in. And then actually, when you come to the contract management stage, it should all be laid out clearly. Everyone knows where they stand on that.
Thanks, Nathan. So once a contract's live, what really matters? What are the absolute essentials schools and trusts should have in place to manage contracts effectively?
Sure. So assuming that we've obviously prepared and planned our contract well, you should have clear service level agreements and KPIs. That includes things like response times, standards that they're working to, metrics that you can measure on. A good KPI schedule probably shouldn't have more than 5 to 10 KPIs. It should be straightforward and simple. It's about boiling down what are the key things that you need to know in terms of what's working well with that contract. Unfortunately, every contract's different, so you do have to stop and think about how do I measure this. But what gets measured gets managed. And obviously as well, KPIs and SLAs enable you to hold suppliers to account. So those can be linked to things like payment schedules and bonus payments and etc. and things like that. So it's really important to have those, and a good contract will have a regular performance review. So in some cases that could be monthly, or it could be quarterly or termly. I would expect on that for suppliers to be reporting on KPIs. And yes, I am talking more sort of your larger contracts, your services like your catering and your cleaning, and perhaps things like your HR and payroll and things like that. again, proportionality is really key in terms of not putting too much administration into a contract, because obviously a supplier will charge you anyway, but ensuring that you've got enough to make sure that they're aware that you're on top of it. So it could be things like getting customer feedback. Has there been any incidents or complaints? And equally, the type of relationship that you're aiming for is a collaborative one, where there is a sharing of potential improvement opportunities. A good supplier who knows where they stand and feels treated respectfully and fairly will be more willing to offer added value and improvement opportunities. It's also about having centralized records. The key thing, and with the Procurement Act now in place since February, and for those of you who may have been on the Procurement Act training, you'll know more about this. I think we've got one coming up in June, haven't we, Victoria? We'll talk about that later. But the Procurement Act itself will require a lot of transparency going forward, where you are obliged to be placing updates on performance of suppliers, whether you've made any modifications to the contract or variations, and indeed right at the end of the contract when you come to terminate, whether that's just natural expiry of the contract or whether there's been some sort of early termination issue. So having a centralized record of that is really key. Naturally, there will always be potential for disputes and issues arising. Hey, we deal with humans. We're all, we all fall short at times, and mistakes happen. But in a collaborative arrangement, a collaborative relationship, and this is where relationship management comes in, it's about having clear escalation paths, a process. There should be within your contract a dispute resolution process and agreed timelines for that, but also consequences for ongoing non-performance. So again, there's not been many occasions where I've had to do this, but there have been some where, for whatever reason, a supplier he's having difficulty and just doesn't perform. Your ultimate responsibility is to your school, to your MAP, to your pupils and students. So we've got to deal with non-performance and just not let it fester. But there has to be escalation and dispute resolution plans within that. Stakeholder communication is key. Communication in any relationship is key. But things like, who are the key stakeholders? Who are the people on the ground? So contracts often have three levels of relationship. You have the service delivery relationship. So that could be the caretaker that you employ who deals with the outsourced cleaning contract, and they have a first-hand experience. You then have the relationship management level, which is often the account manager and whoever is responsible, be that yourself, the CFO, the budget holder, or the school business manager. And then you have what's called the contract administration level, where that's very administrative and you can request reports and updates. But it's those three layers of relationship that are really key. And it's about who are the key stakeholders in that, particularly those who are on the ground, those who are living and breathing that contract and working with that supplier. And then the other essential, the final essential, is around just knowing the key dates. And I think we had one comment on there around we struggle to know the dates. Again, it's really important that public procurement is unforgiving when it comes to not planning and not seeing in advance the need to re-procure. So notice periods. So again, the classic one is we don't know when the contract's ending. It's in the supplier's absolute interest to not tell you. I think Napoleon once said, don't interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. It's just bad manners. Not that a supplier should see you as an enemy, but certainly it's in their interest to not notify you that a contract is ending and then wait until the last week to say, oh, did you know our contract expires next week? But it's fine. We can continue if you just sign here. Inadvertently, you then sign onto their terms and conditions, which obviously puts the leverage back onto them. And unfortunately, this is a power balance relationship. What we're looking for is a win-win, fair and equitable relationship. And you can assure that if you have good terms and conditions and you're on top of that and you've got notice periods that you are aware of. Otherwise, you put yourself at risk of supplier leverage. And that's where the supplier can then come and, like I say, give you a week's notice. You can't not have a catering contract next week. It would, there are certain contracts that would simply just not be an option. So you've just passed all the power over to the supplier. So having an understanding of when does the contract expire, and crucially, what is the retender time? What is the re-procurement time within that? And how long will it take us to re-procure? And in the context of the Procurement Act, in some cases for complicated services contracts, you can be talking 6 months, particularly if there's TUPE involved. So a key tool for staying on top of all of that administration is having a contracts register. I would expect to see in a contracts register start and end dates of contracts, lead time for re-procurement, obviously supplier name, description and category of what the services and goods are, whether it was procured under Public Contract Regulations 15 or PA 23, and that has implications for transparency and reporting under the Procurement Act 23 or PA 23, and who the key contacts are and key stakeholders. Fortunately, Education Buying, we have a free contract register tool. It enables you to input your details into that for your contracts. That in itself will help you to be on top of these relationships. It will help you to manage and monitor these contracts, which in turn will help you to ensure compliance, reduce risk, and just effectively enable you to make smarter decisions, because a rushed contract is never a good contract. So do make use of those tools. And if you don't have a contracts register, which in turn helps you to inform a forward procurement plan, then this should be priority number one for you now, particularly in the context of the new Procurement Act. So we have a bit of a contract management checklist. So particularly for MATs, do centralize your contract records. One of the classic ones is each school has a different version, or they have different suppliers for the same things. So again, it's just having a handle on who's signed up to what, making sure there's clear ownership. I am seeing, and this is great news for us procurement professionals, an increase in the number of procurement type roles popping up, particularly in big MATs. Procurement is not just a back office function anymore. It is a strategically critical function. I can say that. I've been doing it for a while. But again, it's about having clear ownership. Whether you have a procurement person or not, someone needs to take responsibility for these. It's about understanding and having copies of your contracts. What terms are they on? So that if there is an issue, you know where to go. You're not scrabbling for it at the bottom of a filing cabinet. Tracking key dates and setting reminders. We've had a poll. Do you want a copy of the full checklist? I'm going to answer yes, please, because I think, that'd be great. I'm just going to answer that and click submit. Brilliant. It enables you to monitor supply performance, log and formalize any changes, and ultimately all of this checklist ensures that you are compliant. But even things like other compliances like safeguarding, GDPR, it helps you to track and manage your budget. So again, it is administration, but it's strategic, because we know that if a contract fails, particularly a service critical contract, it can have dramatic implications for the working and the obviously the delivery of the school services.
Okay, so there's been a lot of change within the Procurement Act 2023 for schools managing contracts. What are the key updates that really matter?
Sure. So this is very much a quick snippet. Obviously, we've got training, more thorough training on the Procurement Act, but effectively, it's transparency, Victoria. So any contract awarded now under a bespoke tender under the Procurement Act will be subject to quite a lot of transparency. So that'll be potentially annual submission of KPI outcomes. That applies to contracts over 5 million. So if you have a contract over 5 million, then you have to publish an open notice that's out in the public on the performance of the supplier. Those performance notice are used by Cabinet Office to assess the performance of suppliers across the public sector. So whether you're a school, housing, hospital, whatever, suppliers can be potentially subject to something called debarment if they're been found to be persistently non-performing. So it's really key that everyone's reporting on the performance of suppliers. Contract changes, they happen. We have variation clauses for that reason. But under the Procurement Act, any modifications that are made, you have to publish a contract change notice, which is a notice setting out your intention to modify the contract and what the justifications are. There are certain safe harbors for making changes, those which have already been accounted for in the contract itself, but often there can be unforeseen changes needed. So those are required to be published now, transparency. And as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, at the end of the contract, whether that's the natural end of the contract or whether there's an early termination of a contract, you must now also issue a contract termination notice, which effectively is a notice setting out and publicly notifying that the contract has ended. So a lot of transparency, Victoria, required. But again, this only applies to contracts awarded since February 2025 when the new Procurement Act, and not those contracts awarded under existing frameworks, dynamic purchasing systems. So only bespoke contracts that you've entered into. Okay, so if you do need help managing contracts, which obviously that's what we live and breathe, we do have support around that. Obviously, we can undertake contract reviews and support that. We can't give legal advice, but we can certainly give contract advice around that. Another poll has popped up. There we go. Performance monitoring support. We have the free contracts register, which will provide renewal and compliance reminders. And again, just tailored consultancy for schools and trusts. One of the areas that we're finding is particularly of interest at the moment is reviewing of policies in light of the new Procurement Act. So if you haven't looked at your procurement policy in the last year or so, then I would advise you probably need to be doing that in light of the new Procurement Act. And again, that's something that we can support you with, as well as training, wider training and implementation of that policy.
Which I think you've already mentioned, but there's the training. So we are providing further training in June. So it's June the 17th from 9:30 till 12. So it's a 2.5-hour online training session where we'll provide you with further knowledge and practical tools to understand these changes, improve your procurement strategies and ensure compliance with the national regulations. So you can find the link to book the training in the chat. So do please sign up if you are interested in it.
Very popular, and we've put on more sessions as a result, because this is about specifically tailored to education. This is about the new Procurement Act, which came into force in February, which you are all obviously subject to. There are a few exclusions for schools, but not many. So this is an overview of the Procurement Act. What do you need to know in order to be compliant going forward? So yes, do have a think about it and encourage thoughts around this. And as well, just it includes all where you can find further advice, guidance and support as well regarding the Procurement Act.
Okay, Nathan, we do have a question. So we are a federation of 7 primary schools in Hackney. We do tendering centrally, for example, ICT contracts, which was a recent one. But then each school has an individual contract with the supplier. So different start dates, different KPIs, T's and C's, etc. Any tips on how to effectively manage and monitor performance centrally over these 7 individual contracts with the same supplier?
Sure. So much depends on the legal standing of your arrangement. So if your schools are all separate legal entities, then that's appropriate for them to have different contracts. and it's down to effectively each of the schools to sort of manage those accordingly. If you are one legal entity, then yes, it's absolutely fine to have slightly modified specifications for each school, particularly in terms of implementation and things like SLAs and things. But it should just be one overarching contract in the main, because otherwise, okay, so it's 7 different legal entities. Okay, so in that regard, yes, quite right, each contract is its own right. That does make it a little bit of a headache, I'm afraid, to sort of coordinate that. Effectively, you manage it as 7 contracts, not one contract, because each contract is legally binding on its own right, subject to its own terms. You could have a scenario where one school terminates and the others don't, or a combination of, and again, in that regard, you wouldn't have many options, because each of the schools, as you've just said, are separate. So I think you can have a scenario where you act as a centralized purchasing body and you procure on behalf of the 7, and then the 7 become effectively sub parties to that main contract, but you'd have to have an identified lead contracting party. That'd be one way to pull it all together into a single contract. But if those contracts are already in place and signed, there's probably not much you can do at this point going forward. But certainly the next time you procure those, it's worth having to think about, does one take a lead on behalf of the others and they access a single contract, but one party acts as the lead contracting party? It's probably a bit more complicated of an answer. No problem at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending this morning, and I